Hello again, and welcome to Module 7 of the Microsoft Azure Certified Administrator course. In this module, we're going to be taking a look at some sample exam questions. We're going to take a look at the styles of exam questions that might be out there, and go through some other steps just to make sure we're fully ready to sit and pass this exam. In today's module, let's take a look at an action point you have about the revision notes for this course. Let's then go on to have a look at a recap of the exam question types you might come up against. Let's have a quick recap on exam simulation questions. Then let's go through some example questions that you may potentially come up across in the exam that will test your knowledge about creating virtual machines, configuring virtual networks, managing identity, and configuring storage accounts. Then finally, as usual, we'll have a final recap on course housekeeping frequently asked questions. Let's take a look at the exam revision notes. Let's take a look at a readiness review question around storage accounts. It's important you get a feel for the kind of level of knowledge you need to be able to display in the exam. Also as well to have a feel for how these questions are going to look and feel. This first readiness review question is an example of a drag and drop question. Here we're given a scenario in the question. The scenario tells us we have an Azure subscription that has a storage account in it. It also tells us we have an on-prem server named Server 1 that runs Windows Server 2016. We're also told that Server 1 has 2 terabytes of data on it. Our objective is to transfer those 2 terabytes of data to the storage account in Azure using the Azure Import-Export service. In which order should we perform the actions? To answer the question, we need to move all the actions from the list of actions on the left-hand side and arrange them into the correct order on the right-hand side. The exam's calling out to our attention here as well that more than one order of answers will provide a correct answer overall. We'll receive credit for any correct combination and any correct order that we provide. So let's have a think back to what we've learned about this scenario. Well, first of all, the Azure Import-Export service is the Azure mechanism we can use where we can take one of our hard drives, copy some data onto it, make sure it's encrypted, and ship it into Azure. And the Azure engineers will then attach it into Azure and copy the data onto a storage account for us. So let's take a look at the actions we need to approve. So first thing we've got to do is actually attach the external disk to Server 1. So that means either plugging it into a USB port or plugging it in through like a hot plug and play type of port. Then on Server 1, we need to run the WAI import utility. What that means is that utility that we download from the Azure website is going to prep that physical removable hard drive to be able to store that data. Then what we do is we go into the Azure portal and we create an import job in there. What that's going to do is create a record of the import job and make sure Azure is expecting it. Then, once we've copied the data across, we then detach the external disks from Server 1 and ship the disks to the Azure data center. What we then do is go into the Azure portal and update the import job, and that should tell Azure that it's being shipped and that the Azure engineers should be ready to collect it. So, as you can see here, there's a pretty logical series of activities that we need to go through to answer this question. So when answering it, we drag and drop the relevant steps into the answer area and we order it into the right area. One of the things to watch out for, in this case, the exam question has told us that we need to move all of the actions from the list. That means every action that's there in the actions list is going to comprise part of the solution. So the points we're going to get here is all about getting these answers in the correct order. Watch out for subtle hints like that in these questions. Sometimes you might come across drag and drop questions where there are a specific number of answers that you need to bring across. In some cases, they may let you move all the answers across. And in some cases, they might give you a bit of a hint in the question as to what the resultant answer should look like. Let's take a look at a couple of readiness review questions that tackle Azure virtual machines. This is an example of the classic multiple choice question that we're being asked here. Here, the exam question is telling us that we have Azure virtual machines as shown in the following table. So we've got virtual machines named VM1, 2, 3, and 4. The first 2 of those virtual machines have been deployed into the West Europe region. The second 2 have been deployed into North Europe. We have an Azure Recovery Services Vault that protects VM1 and VM2. But we now need to protect VM3 and VM4 using Azure Recovery Services. What should we do first? So let's take a look at what the information that the question is actually giving us here. We've got 4 virtual machines spread across 2 regions. We're then told that we already have a Recovery Services Vault that protects Virtual Machine 1 and Virtual Machine 2. Because of the way Recovery Services works, a Recovery Services Vault needs to be in the same Azure region as any virtual machines it's protecting. So what that then means, if we want to then go and start protecting VM3 and VM4, we'll need to have a Recovery Services Vault in the North Europe region. We can't use the existing West Europe one because it's in the wrong place for those virtual machines. So that tells me that my first step here is going to be to create a new Recovery Services Vault here. Now, this is one of those scenarios where I'm really kind of picking the best answer from a bad bunch here. In the real world, would I already have a Recovery Services Vault in North Europe? Maybe I might have. So maybe in the real world that's not the right answer. But creating a new Recovery Services Vault, that is the most correct answer in this circumstance. So let's take a look at the other answers and understand why they are wrong. So answer A, configure the extensions for VM3 and VM4. Okay, virtual machine extensions, they're in the operating system by default now. We don't need to do anything with that. We don't need to put anything inside of a virtual machine for Recovery Services because Recovery Services works at the storage replication level. It replicates the image of the virtual machine from the storage. Recovery Services doesn't really talk inside the virtual machine operating system. It looks at storage and replicates changes at the storage level. So configuring storage extensions will not help us here. Creating a storage account, that's not going to help us either. If you think back to what we do when we create a Recovery Services Vault, the vault itself manages its own storage. So somewhere deep underneath the hood within Azure, there'll be a storage account in there or still be storage services that's being used by the Recovery Services Vault, but we're not creating a storage account ourselves. We'll just create the new Recovery Services Vault, and that will create and manage its own storage as it sees fit. And then action D, create a new backup policy. Well, we're not backing up machines here, are we? We're replicating them from one site to another. So creating a new backup policy isn't going to help us either. So here's another example of a question where you have to pick the most correct solution. And when you come across questions like this, go for the answer that you believe is right, and then double check your thinking by looking at the answers that you believe to be wrong and just checking that they are the wrong answers. More often than not, when you come across a situation like this, where you're unsure if the right answer is the right answer, double check on what the question is asking you, but also as well validate by checking the wrong answers are the wrong answers. In this next question, we're being told that we have an Azure subscription with 100 virtual machines in it. We're also told that we regularly create and delete virtual machines. We need to identify unused disks that can be deleted. What should we do? So to answer this question, we need a couple of bits of knowledge. First of all, we need some experience with Cloud9 or Azure Cost Manager. One of the things Cloud9 does for us, and also Azure Cost Manager does for us, is it helps us identify unused resources. So if we go look in Azure Cost Management or Cloud9, you can have a look in the Optimizer tab and it'll generate a report from there. One of the things that report will generate is a list of detached virtual machine hard drives that can potentially be deleted to save costs. The other bit of knowledge we need to have on our mind here as well is that when we create a virtual machine and when we create a virtual machine, we have to create at least 2 virtual hard drives with it for the temp drive and the system drive. And we'll potentially also be creating other virtual hard drives that go alongside that to store data. When we delete or deprovision a virtual machine, those virtual hard drives don't go anywhere. Azure is assuming that you don't want to get rid of the delete data, so you would need to go in specifically and delete the virtual hard drives that go with that virtual machine. The idea there is just because you're deleting a virtual machine doesn't mean to say you want to delete the attached virtual hard drives to it. That's why Cloud9 and Azure Cost Manager give us an optimizer report that identifies basically orphaned virtual machines that could potentially be deleted. Let's have a look at the type of questions you might come up against when you're coming into the Manage Identities objective of the exam. In this multiple choice question, we're given a scenario, which is, we are the global administrator for an Azure Active Directory Azure AD tenant named adatum.com. From the Azure Active Directory blade, we assign the conditional access administrator role to a user. We then need to ensure that admin1 has just-in-time access applied to it as a conditional access administrator. What should we do next? So again, here with just one very simple multiple choice question, Microsoft is actually probing your knowledge around Azure AD quite deeply here. Let's have a look at the answers. What are we trying to do here? We're trying to make sure that admin1 has just-in-time access because he's a conditional administrator access role. So just-in-time access, if you remember back to module 4, that's the ability for Azure to be able to turn on network access for things like remote desktop and for web application and for various ports on a virtual machine if we need to go in to administer it. The fact that it's just-in-time access means we can request access to that resource and the network security group will be configured to allow us in. Then when we're finished, it'll stop allowing people in through that port. The whole idea is that we're only exposing particular ports at particular times when we know some sort of administration's going on. So what we need to do here is identify the action here that is going to allow admin1 to be able to have just-in-time access. So what's testing our knowledge of here is how do we do that? So if we were to come along and enable AD multi-factor authentication, that's not necessarily going to give us the ability to, that's not going to give us the rights to have just-in-time access to virtual machines. Azure multi-factor authentication is something that we give even just to end users. The idea is it's just about them proving they are who they say they are by having a multiple form of identity, for example, like a mobile phone or an alternative email account or maybe some sort of biometrics device. If we set admin1 as being eligible for the conditional access administrator role, all that's going to do is what we've already done. Yeah, it's going to give him the rights to be able to be a conditional access administrator. What that means is he'll be able to come in and administer the conditional access service that allows people to be able to connect into the Azure portal or to other Azure AD controlled resources, depending on the configuration of his device or where he's connecting from and other factors like that. That doesn't help us in this particular circumstance. The third incorrect option here would be to enable Azure AD Identity Protection. Azure AD Identity Protection is basically a fraudulent use service. What it'll do is look at where your Azure AD identity is being used on the public internet. And whenever anybody tries to authenticate using your Azure AD identity, Azure AD becomes aware of it. And it can look at things like, where have you logged in from? What IP address have you logged in from? What device have you logged in from? How does that match up with your known behavior and your established pattern of behavior? And if it sees any activity that's a bit suspicious, so for example, maybe you logged in at 10 a.m. from a desktop in London, and then you logged in again from a mobile device in Nigeria, it's going to know that's an impossible geographical situation and that something suspicious is happening there. So it's pretty clear that Azure Identity Protection isn't actually going to help us to be able to require just-in-time access. So the correct action here is we need to set admin1 as being eligible for the privileged role administrator, the privileged role administrator role. By adding the admin1 user object into that role, he then has the ability to be able to request just-in-time access to a machine. What we're saying is because he's a privileged role administrator, he's got the ability to have, we'll allow him to have access when he needs it. So remember that for the exam. Now let's have a look at an exam sample question around virtual networking. This is an example of an exhibit-based question. What that means is we're given something from, usually a screenshot from a system somewhere that tells us the configuration of something. We have to look and analyze the information that's in the exhibit and try and identify what's happening in the scenario from that. So the questioning is telling us that we have an Azure subscription named Subscription 1. Subscription 1 contains a virtual machine called VM1. We have a computer named Computer 1 that runs Windows 10. Computer 1 is connected to the internet. We add a network interface to VM1 as shown in the exhibit. From Computer 1, we attempt to connect to VM1 using remote desktop, but the connection fails. We need to establish a remote desktop connection with VM1. What should we do first? So in this question, we're given 4 answers that kind of lead us to things that might be wrong. What we need to do is come back and look at the exhibit and try and identify why it is we can't connect to this virtual machine. So let's go through this step by step. If I take a look at the network interface, I can see it's called Interface 1. It also has an effective set of rules in it that allow access in this network security group. We can see that it's attached to a virtual network, but it also has a public IP address as well. So it has a public IP and a private IP. Now, if we go down and look at the ports on the network security group, what we can see is that we've got like a catch-all rule of a very, very high priority that says no other traffic is allowed in. That's that deny rule at the bottom of the inbound rules list. Up towards the top, though, we've got a rule that says allow access on port 3389 over TCP from any destination. What that means is any machine that's connected to the public internet or that Azure virtual network should be able to create an RDP session to this machine through its public IP address. So that tells me that I don't need to attach another network interface to this. This is doing its job just fine. In most cases, you don't need to add a second network interface just to get an external connection, because if you think back to what we discussed in the virtual networking stuff in Module 4, you'll remember that a single network interface can have both a public IP address and a private IP address bound to it at the same time. Let's take a look. So if we have a look at the deny all outbound port rule, if we were to turn that off, that's not going to change anything because the allow RDP port rule has a lower priority number, meaning it's more important. If we were to delete that allow all inbound traffic, we'd effectively be putting in quite a dangerous configuration there that would allow anybody to be able to connect to that virtual machine over the public internet. And that's obviously not something that we want to do. Not only is it not going to fix this problem because it's not the cause, it's not going to help us, it's also going to weaken the configuration of the security. The same thing goes with the delete the all inbound and all outbound port rules as well. If we delete those rules, all we're going to do is allow unnecessary traffic to come out of this virtual machine that we shouldn't necessarily be permitting. All we want to be able to do is RDP to this machine. So the only port we need to have is that inbound traffic of 3389. So our network security groups are actually pretty well configured for what we want to achieve here. So that tells me that, yeah, this network security group is fine. The public IP configuration, from what we can see of it's fine as well. It's a fairly safe assumption to make that the network configuration is good. So we know that attaching a network interface isn't going to help us. We know our deny all outbound and deny our all inbound rules are good. They're fit for purpose. That leaves us with the remaining option of starting the virtual machine. Now, unless I'm missing something when I look at this machine, what I can't see on there is the status of my virtual machine. I can't gauge that from this screenshot at all. But it's a safe assumption to make that it's the one thing that doesn't break the solution anymore. So starting the VM is the next logical step to do. So again, one of the things here is you have to be able to interpret this information and bring a little bit of real-world experience to play as well. I've basically selected answer A as being the correct one by a process of elimination. I've deduced that answers B, C, and D don't help the situation at all. Therefore, I believe answer A to be the correct one. Thank you very much for listening to all this garbage. I hope it hasn't battered your brain too much. Good luck with the exam, and I will hopefully see you soon on the AZ-300 course.